She spent 8 months letting a small mountain hospital believe she couldn't handle the sight of blood. Then a wildfire jumped the ridge, swallowed an entire town in smoke, and the quiet nurse everyone called slow finally showed them exactly what she used to be. Sierra Ridge Medical Center sat at the edge of the California foothills, a squat, aging brick building that served 4,000 year-round residents, and however many hikers, campers, and weekend tourists happened to be passing through. It was a critical access hospital, which was a polite bureaucratic term for a place that handled broken arms, heat stroke, the occasional bear encounter, and elderly patients who'd taken a bad fall on their porch steps. On a busy Saturday, the ER saw maybe 12 patients. It was not built for catastrophe. It had never needed to be. Into this sleepy rhythm walked Wren Halloway. Wren was 36, though the stillness in her face made her age hard to place. She wore her dark hair cropped short and practical, kept her scrubs a size too loose, and moved through the department with a kind of careful, deliberate slowness that read, to everyone around her, as hesitation. She flinched, or seemed to, at raised voices. She double-checked simple tasks. She asked quiet, almost apologetic questions before doing anything at all. Within a month, the staff had settled on a name for her that stuck harder than her actual one. Slow Wren. Dr. Preston Gale, the hospital's sole full-time emergency physician, wasn't cruel exactly, but he was the kind of doctor who'd spent 15 years being the smartest person in a very small room and had come to expect it as a permanent condition. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, proud of the framed residency certificate that hung slightly too prominently behind the nurse's station. "Halloway, I need that BP cuff faster than that," he'd say, not unkindly, but with the particular weariness of a man managing someone he considered a liability. "We don't have time to be gentle with the equipment out here." "Sorry, Dr. Gale," Wren would murmur, eyes down, and comply. Charge nurse Odette Finch, a broad, no-nonsense woman who'd worked Sierra Ridge for 18 years, had a soft spot for Wren that she rarely admitted out loud. "You're better than they give you credit for," she told her once, during a slow Tuesday shift. "I've seen you get an IV into Old Man Whitfield's rolling veins on the first stick. That's not nothing." "I just got lucky," Wren said, and went back to restocking the crash cart. What none of them knew, what Wren had buried under 8 months of quiet, unremarkable competence, was that she had once been Staff Sergeant Wren Halloway, a Special Forces medical sergeant, an 18 Delta, attached to a 12-man operational detachment Alpha that had spent the better part of a decade in some of the worst places on Earth. Her radio call sign, known to a small circle of men who would have walked through fire for her, and several times was Highlander. She had run trauma care under fire in 3 countries. She had a bronze star with a V device for valor that sat in a drawer at her mother's house, wrapped in a dish towel, because she couldn't stand to look at it. She had left the army 4 years ago after a mission in the mountains of a country she was still not allowed to name out loud, an operation that had gone bad in ways she didn't talk about, not even to the therapist the VA had assigned her. 2 of her men hadn't come home. She had. She'd come to Sierra Ridge because it was small and quiet and about as far from a war zone as a hospital could get. She had promised herself, the way people promise themselves things they desperately need to be true, that if she just kept her head down, took the easy shifts, let people underestimate her, she could finally exhale. She could be nobody. Nobody had a body count. Nobody had nightmares about a canyon in the dark. It worked. For 8 months. Until the last week of September, when the wind changed. The Cutter Ridge fire had been burning for 6 days in the wilderness, 15 miles to the east. A stubborn, slow-moving thing that the incident command teams had been confident they could hold at the ridgeline. Then a red flag warning rolled in. Sustained winds gusting past 50 miles an hour, humidity in the single digits, temperatures pushing 105, and at 4:40 on a Thursday afternoon, the fire didn't hold. It exploded. Within 90 minutes, the flames had covered 11 miles of dry chaparral and pine, jumped 2 containment lines, and reached the outskirts of the town itself. The sky over Sierra Ridge turned the color of a bruise, then the color of blood, then simply black, lit from beneath by an orange glow that made the whole valley look like it was standing at the mouth of something enormous and hungry. The evacuation order came too late for a town that only had one road out. By 5:15, that road was a parking lot. Cars packed bumper to bumper, engines running, ash falling like dirty snow onto windshields. Families abandoned homes with whatever they could carry, and on a 2-lane mountain highway with a sheer drop on one side, panicked drivers in zero visibility did what panicked drivers do. They crashed, over and over, all along the evacuation route, in the smoke and the chaos and the roaring wind. Sierra Ridge Medical Center, a 12-bed critical access hospital designed for Saturday afternoon sprained ankles, became the only functioning trauma-receiving facility for a town on fire. "Dr. Gale," Odette's voice cracked as she burst through the ambulance bay doors, phone in hand. "Dispatch says we've got multiple MVAs on the evacuation route, plus burn victims coming in from the trailer park off Route 9. They're saying it could be dozens. County's diverting everyone here. Mercy General's road is already cut off by the fire." Gale's face went the color of old paper. "Dozens? We have 4 open beds. I know what we have." Outside, the first ambulance was already screaming into the bay, followed by a pickup truck with 3 people crammed in the cab, one of them screaming, her arms wrapped in what used to be a shirt, now blackened and stuck to raw, weeping skin. The ER dissolved into the particular chaos of an emergency nobody had trained for. Gale moved from patient to patient, but his hands were shaking, his voice pitching higher with every new stretcher that came through the doors. A construction worker with a crushed pelvis from a rollover. A woman with smoke inhalation so severe her lips had gone a terrifying shade of blue. A teenage boy with 2nd and 3rd degree burns creeping up both forearms, screaming in a way that emptied out every other sound in the room. Wren stood near the supply closet, a stack of gauze in her hands, watching. For 8 months, she had watched this room the way a soldier watches terrain, cataloging exits, noting who moved with purpose and who moved with panic, filing away the location of every piece of equipment without ever seeming to look for it. She had done it out of habit, not intention. Now the habit paid its debt in full. She watched the woman with smoke inhalation, watched the way her chest was pulling inward at the base of her throat with every breath, watched her fingertips turning that same terrible blue as her lips, and knew, with the flat, wordless certainty of someone who had seen this exact death a dozen times before, that the woman had less than 3 minutes before her airway closed completely. "Dr. Gale," Wren said, not loud, just clear enough to cut through. Gale, elbow deep in the construction worker's pelvic exam, didn't look up. "Little busy, Wren. She's about to lose her airway." Wren nodded toward the smoke inhalation patient. "Strider's audible from here. If you intubate now, it's a straightforward tube. In 2 minutes, the swelling closes it, and you're doing a surgical airway blind, in a hallway, with what you've got on that cart." Gale looked up this time, irritation flashing across his face at being corrected by the nurse everyone called slow. But something in her voice, steady, flat, entirely without the tremor that had colonized his own, made him pause half a second too long to dismiss it outright. The woman's monitor screamed, her oxygen saturation cratered. "Move!" Gale said, abandoning the pelvis, sprinting for the airway kit. He got the tube in with seconds to spare, his hands shaking so badly Wren had to steady the laryngoscope handle without either of them acknowledging it happened. The woman's chest rose. The monitor's shriek dropped back into a normal rhythm. That was the first crack in 8 months of careful invisibility. It would not be the last. More patients poured in. The hospital's 4 open beds became 6, became 10, with gurneys lined up in the hallway, became simply the floor. Patients laid on blankets between the nurse's station and the supply room because there was nowhere else to put them. The smoke outside had turned the parking lot lights into dim orange smears. Somewhere in the building, a fire alarm that no one had time to silence kept chirping its low battery warning, a small, absurd sound underneath the screaming and the sirens and the wind. Gale was drowning, Anyone paying attention could see it. The too fast hands, the orders that contradicted themselves, the way he kept returning to the same patient 3 times without finishing the first assessment. He was a good doctor for a quiet Saturday. He had never been trained for this, and the gap between what he knew and what the room needed was widening by the minute, and people were going to die inside that gap. Odette caught Wren's eye across the chaos. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Both women had watched the same thing happen in the last 20 minutes. A system quietly failing under a weight it was never built to carry. A new stretcher came through the doors, wheeled by 2 exhausted volunteer firefighters, faces streaked black with soot. On it lay a middle-aged man, his chest a mess of blunt trauma from where the steering column had crushed into him during a rollover on the evacuation route. His breathing was a wet, uneven rattle. One side of his chest wasn't rising at all. "BP's tanking," one of the firefighters said. "We got him out fast, but I think something's wrong with his lung." Gale turned toward the new patient, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. A man 3 decisions behind and losing more ground every second. Get him a chest x-ray. I need to see the..." "There's no time for imaging," Wren said. Everyone in the immediate vicinity turned. It was the tone as much as the words. The same flat, carrying authority that had cut through the room 20 minutes earlier, except this time, there was no hesitation folded into it at all. The stillness that had made her seem slow for 8 months resolved, in an instant, into something else entirely. Something that looked, to anyone who'd ever served, exactly like combat calm. Tracheal deviation to the left, absent breath sounds on the right, distended neck veins, hypotension. Wren said, already moving, already stripping off the oversized cardigan she wore over her scrubs like it was a costume she no longer needed. Tension pneumothorax. He's got minutes, not an x-ray's worth of time. "Wren, that's not your call to make," Gale started. "It's the only call there is." She was already at the man's side, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that made the 2 firefighters step back instinctively, the way people step back from someone who clearly knows exactly what they're doing. "I need a 14-gauge needle, 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now, or I do it with what's in my pocket." Nobody moved fast enough. Wren didn't wait. She grabbed the needle off the nearest tray herself, found the space by feel, the same way she'd found it in the dark, in the dust, in a canyon in a country she still wasn't supposed to name, and drove it home. The hiss of escaping air was audible across the room. The man's next breath came easier. His monitor, which had been sliding toward a flat, terrifying rhythm, steadied. The ER went quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when everyone in it has just watched something they don't have a name for. Gale stared at her. "How did you—" "We don't have time for that conversation right now, doctor," Wren said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the blunt economy of someone triaging every word the same way she triaged every patient. "You have a room full of people who are about to die out of order. I can help you keep that from happening, or you can keep asking me questions. Pick one." He picked the first one. It was, perhaps, the smartest decision he made all night. What followed was 2.5 hours that the staff of Sierra Ridge Medical Center would talk about for years afterward, quietly, reverently, the way people talk about things that reordered what they thought was possible. Wren Halloway took the center of that ruined ER and turned it, patient by patient, into something that functioned. She established a rough triage line in the hallway, red, yellow, green, scrawled on masking tape stuck to gurney rails, because there was no time for anything more formal. She talked Gale through a needle decompression on a second patient, when the first one repeated itself 20 minutes later on a woman crushed against her own steering wheel. She packed burn wounds with the calm, economical motion of someone who had done it 100 times in far worse light. She caught a pediatric patient's silent, developing shock. A boy who'd been quiet and compliant, and therefore nearly missed, because the screaming patients always get the attention, and the quiet ones are sometimes the ones circling the drain, and got fluids into him before his pressure fully collapsed. She didn't raise her voice. Not once. She didn't need to. The command in it didn't come from volume. It came from the absolute, bone-deep certainty of someone who had done this before, in far worse conditions, with far worse odds, and had made her peace a long time ago with the fact that some of the calls she made would be wrong and she would have to live with them anyway. Odette worked beside her, without needing to be told what to do next, falling into the rhythm the way a good partner falls into rhythm with someone who suddenly, finally, makes sense. "Where did you learn to do all this?" she asked once, low, in the 90 seconds of quiet between patients. Wren didn't look up from the line she was securing. A long time ago, somewhere far from here. It was the most either of them said about it, and it was enough. Just past 9 o'clock, with the worst of the wave finally cresting, and the parking lot outside glowing a deep, unnatural orange from the fire still chewing through the ridge above town, a new sound cut through the chaos, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that grew from a distant hum into something that rattled the windows in their frames. "That's not life flight," one of the volunteer firefighters said, frowning toward the ceiling. "Life flight's grounded. Nothing civilians flying in this smoke." He was right. What descended through the smoke-choked dark onto the hospital's cramped helipad was a military HH-60, its rotors kicking up a violent storm of ash and grit, its fuselage marked with the insignia of an Air National Guard rescue wing. The kind of aircraft that flew when nothing else could, into conditions that grounded everyone else, because pulling people out of exactly this kind of impossible situation was the entire reason it existed. 3 figures dropped from the side door before the wheels had even fully settled, moving low and fast against the rotor wash, faces obscured by smoke masks and NVGs pushed up onto their helmets. The lead figure, broad-shouldered, moving with the unmistakable economy of someone who had walked into 1,000 worse rooms than this one, pushed through the ambulance bay doors and scanned the chaos with quick, assessing eyes. "I'm looking for the ranking medical authority," he said, voice carrying easily over the noise, pulling off his smoke mask to reveal a face weathered by sun and altitude and years of doing exactly this kind of work. "We got diverted off a search pattern up the ridge on reports of a hospital completely overwhelmed. County said you might need extraction support." Gale, hollow-eyed and finally, blessedly stable in the aftermath of the worst 2 hours of his professional life, opened his mouth to answer. But the pararescueman's gaze had already slid past him, tracking across the room, and stopped. On a woman in blood-stained scrubs, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, calmly securing a chest seal on a burn patient with hands that didn't shake. The man went very still. "Highlander?" he said. The whole room turned. Wren's hands didn't stop moving, but something in her shoulders locked, just for a moment, the way a person locks when a door from a life they'd sealed shut swings suddenly open again. She looked up, and for the first time in 8 months, her face wasn't unreadable. It was something raw and startled and, underneath all of it, something that looked almost like relief. "Boone," she said quietly. "What the hell are you doing in California? Guard unit these days." Master Sergeant Cassius Boone said, crossing the room in 3 long strides, ignoring the stunned silence spreading behind him like a held breath. "Same job, different uniform. County reached out for search and rescue support, and somebody mentioned there was a hospital in the burn zone running on fumes. I didn't know you'd be the one running it." He looked at her, really looked, taking in the blood, the calm, the room she'd single-handedly organized out of catastrophe, and something like a rough, disbelieving laugh escaped him. "Should have known. You always did show up exactly where the fire was worst." Gale found his voice. "You two. You know each other?" Boone turned to him, and the warmth in his face didn't vanish, but it hardened at the edges into something closer to disbelief. "Know her? Doctor, this woman is the reason I've got 3 fingers instead of none." She held a forward aid station together for 9 hours under sustained fire in a valley I'm not allowed to name, with 2 of her own team down, and got every single patient she touched out alive, except the 2 who were already gone before she reached them. She's got a bronze star with a V that the army had to practically staple to her jacket because she wouldn't come pick it up. He shook his head slowly, looking around the ER, The triage tags on masking tape, the airways secured, the burns dressed, the room that should have been a disaster, and instead was, however roughly, under control. And apparently she's been doing this in a 12-bed hospital nobody's ever heard of for the last 8 months, and none of you knew. Gale's face went through several colors in quick succession. He looked at Wren, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd started, and something in his expression cracked open. You've been letting me talk to you like... He stopped, swallowed. 8 months. You never said a word. You never asked why I was quiet, Wren said, not unkindly, tying off the last dressing on the burn patient's arm. You just decided you already knew. There was no more time for the conversation to go further. The fire outside hadn't stopped for the reunion. It was still climbing the ridge, and the hospital still had a full waiting room and a floor full of patients who needed transfer to facilities with more than 12 beds. Boone's team went to work coordinating medevac for the most critical cases, and for the second time that night, the room reorganized itself around competence instead of hierarchy. Except this time, Wren wasn't standing quietly at the edges anymore. She stood in the center of it, working alongside Boone's team with the fluent, wordless coordination of people who had once trusted each other with their lives and had simply picked the thread back up. By 2 a.m., the worst of it had passed. The fire had been beaten back from the town's edge by an exhausted line of engine crews and a wind that had, mercifully, finally shifted. The last critical patients had been airlifted out. The hallway floor, hours ago carpeted in bodies and blood and ash, was quiet again, littered with wrappers and spent gauze, and the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of people who had done more than they thought they had left in them. Wren sat on an overturned supply crate in the ambulance bay, a cup of vending machine coffee going cold in her hands, watching the last of the smoke drift orange-gray across a sky just beginning, faintly, to lighten toward dawn. Odette sat down heavily beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. "You saved this hospital tonight," Odette said finally. "You know that, right? Not just the patients. Gale would have lost this place its license by morning if you hadn't stepped in." Wren shrugged, tired in a way that went past her body. "I just did what needed doing." "That's the thing," Odette said. "You've been doing that quietly for 8 months. We just didn't know how to see it." Dr. Gale found her 20 minutes later, standing in the doorway of the now empty trauma bay, uncharacteristically hesitant. He'd changed out of his blood-soaked coat. His hands, she noticed, had finally stopped shaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a big one. I spent 8 months treating you like you were barely competent to hand me a suture kit, and tonight you ran a mass casualty event better than I've seen anyone run one in 15 years of practicing emergency medicine. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong." Wren studied him for a long moment. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in watching him squirm, just the same tired, honest stillness she'd carried since the day she walked in. "I let you be wrong, doctor. That's on both of us." She took a slow breath. "I came here because I wanted to disappear. Turns out you can't actually do that." "Not really. You can just choose when the truth comes out." Boone found her on his way back to the helicopter, his crew already loading the last of their gear. "Command's going to want a report on tonight," he said. "Your name's going to be in it, whether you like it or not." "I figured. There's still a slot open on a guard rescue squadron, if you ever get tired of sprained ankles and bear encounters." He offered her a tired, genuine smile. "We could use a Highlander." Wren looked past him, toward the ridge where the fire still glowed, dimmer now, retreating. She thought about 8 months of careful invisibility, and about the 2.5 hours that had just undone all of it, and about how much lighter she felt, oddly, now that the secret was finally out in the open air, instead of locked in her chest, like something she had to keep guarding. "I'll think about it," she said. And, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it as something other than a polite way of saying no. The sun came up over Sierra Ridge that morning, on a town still standing, a hospital still open, and a quiet nurse who would never again be mistaken for slow. "If a crisis reveals who someone really is," then the town had learned, in the space of one long and terrible night, that some of the quietest people in the room are quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with weakness, and everything to do with having already carried more than most people will ever have to. If this story of hidden strength, quiet sacrifice, and a night nobody at Sierra Ridge will ever forget kept you watching until the end, hit that like button, share it with someone who believes the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest one, and subscribe to Beyond the Silence Tales for more real-life inspired stories of the quiet people who show up when it matters most.
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. For 8 months they called her Slow Wren. Then a wildfire swallowed the town, and the quiet nurse everyone underestimated ran the worst night of their lives, like she'd done it 100 times before. Because she had. I'd really love to know what you think of this one. How did it make you feel? What stuck with me was that Wren didn't hide because she was ashamed of who she used to be. She hid because she needed somewhere quiet enough to breathe. It just took a disaster for the town to see what quiet can actually hold. Which moment got you the most? Have you ever misjudged someone's silence for something it wasn't? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story kept you watching until the end, feel free to like or subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.